Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this video is going to discuss the Gothic genre. Few things in American literature or film captures the imagination of the popular culture as the Gothic genre. Whether it's horror, which is a subgenre of Gothic, or the European Gothic that we often tap into historically and in present day. There is something about the Gothic genre that taps into who we are and into our imaginations, right? So let me um, first talk about the Gothic genre historically, and then talk about its impact, its importance, and how we might actually recognize the Gothic genre and its conventions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I have prepared a PowerPoint for this discussion to help guide our conversation. Okay? Okay. So I was going to see if I could make this bigger, but that's probably it. No, there we go. Okay. So first, let's talk about how Gothic literature began as a genre. Now, it really begins to organize itself into a genre in late 18th century Europe. That does not suggest that there weren't, Gothic elements to stories way before it began to organize into a genre. It always seeps into stories throughout the centuries, particularly in the Western world. I mean, we can find Gothic genres all the way back into, say, like Beowulf or in Chaucer, of course, in Shakespeare and, et cetera, right? But it really begins to organize into a genre in the 18th century when another movement was going on called Romanticism. Okay, and Romanticism is a genre that came about in the late 18th century in reaction to a movement called the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason really focused on reason, obviously, wit, facts, rather than fantasy, imagination, and that sort of thing. We shouldn't think of romanticism in kind of the way that we use it colloquial now, and that is that, sort of romantic and romantic love. Well, certainly those were parts of the romanticism. Romanticism really focuses much more specifically on emotion, on nature, on individualism, right? And so it's through this idea of romanticism that Gothic literature begins to develop. Okay. Perhaps it is the most notorious novel coming out of that period is Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, who was married to Percy Shelley, one of the main romantic poets of the time period. But of course, The Hunchback of Notre Dame comes out of this period, and it's really kind of sweeping Europe at this time. Now, why? Well, one of the reasons is that the role of women is shifting, especially upper class white women. And they have much more leisure time. They are educated, they are literate, they are able to read. And it turns out they like ghost stories. Um, and so what we see beginning to develop that's quite unique at this time is that we're beginning to get a genre that is largely written by women for women audiences. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't male writers, because of course there were fantastic male writers at the time, and it crossed genders as far as who could enjoy it and who was reading it. but specifically, it was a place where women writers could find a place and be recognized for their writing. The Gothic genre, in order for it to be Gothic, it has to allow for the possibility of the supernatural, right? It has to allow it may turn out in the end that there isn't supernatural, it gets explained away somehow. But if we don't allow for the possibility of monsters, if we don't allow for the possibility of ghosts, right? In our suspension of disbelief, we really can't tap into, right, the suspense of Gothic. And so, it may be, if you know Scooby-Doo, right, a great Gothic cartoon that many grew up with. A lot of times, it must be a ghost, there's a ghost, but it gets explained away, and it's really not a ghost. We have to allow for the possibility of it, right? And it draws on these elements of what the Romantics called the sublime, right? Those elements that created extreme emotion, whether it was love or joy or sadness or fear, right? That it was this sort of idea that through extreme emotion, we could find some kind of truth, as opposed to in the Age of Reason, which it was you went to the mind, right, to get some kind of truth. And the Romantics said, no, really, in order to really explore what it means to be human, we have to trigger those emotions. And of course, in Gothic, often, those emotions are fear and sometimes love. We think about some of the more commonly known things that are hitting our culture in recent years. Wednesday has just been released, right? The second season, but the first season, it kind of blew up Netflix. It was like the number one show on Netflix. And so we see, this great interest, right, in this idea of Gothic. Now, in Wednesday, we also see elements of horror. And again, when the genre first started to be created, there was really no difference between Gothic and horror. What horror became, as we think of it now, really is more of a 20th century phenomenon. But at this time, the idea of Wednesday being Gothic, having those Gothic elements, just really tapped into our imagination. I mean, if we even look at Harry Potter, right? A few years ago, right, it was this huge global phenomenon, and especially Western phenomenon, where between the books and the movies, everybody knew Harry Potter, and everybody knew the characters of Harry Potter, and everybody knew the monsters in Harry Potter. Um, and so we find that this is very much a part of our culture. Now, what are other elements of Gothic? Well, generally there's those medieval tropes, right? But actually, Gothic is kind of anti-medieval. While it brings in some of you might remember um, from a long time ago, maybe not, but Game of Thrones was quite huge, kind of saved HBO. And it has these Gothic elements, right? But it was kind of anti-medieval, right? In that it showed like the tyranny and the barbarousness, the tortures, right, of this imagined medieval reality. And so Gothic kind of draws on that darkness, if you will, to set its stories. Often, at least in early 18th, 19th century European Gothic, there was a mistrust of Catholicism. This comes a lot out of the Spanish Inquisition. You had evil priests and whatnot. That expands later on, as the decades go forward and as it becomes more across countries, to not only a distrust of religion, but it could be any sort of distrust of authoritarian figures that have influence over us. So it could have been, politicians, doctors, any sort of body that has an authoritarian influence over the culture. There was a distrust of inheritance. There was a idea like, the unfairness of primogeniture, things getting passed down through the generations. Um, and so often might accompany that now in Gothic literature is some kind of family curse or, ghost haunting or, vampire, some kind of evil spirit that's going along with that inheritance. And of course, the big things that you'll recognize in Gothic literature is Gothic architecture, whether it's, um, mansions, or trees or, nature or whatnot. But it's always dark. It's usually somehow dilapidated, not kept up. It's not modern, right? If we think of the Haunted Mansion by Disney, right? We all know this, right? There's a haunted mansion in the forest, in the dark, you don't go up there, right? That's not good. That's going to be bad. And within those, haunted mansions, there's usually secret passageways, things like this that disrupt, our sense of safety. Now, eventually, in the mid 19th century, this European Gothic gets translated to America, mostly through the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Edgar Allan Poe, studied in Europe and then kind of brings those ideas into American literature. But he does an interesting thing. And while you must still, when you read Edgar Allan Poe, allow for the possibility of the supernatural, what he begins to really explore is the individual psyche, right? And so what we might look at as go like, oh, is it a ghost? Is this really happening? Or is, our protagonist going mad? Are they going insane? And this is a common trope through our films and stories even today. If we think of, some of the Leonardo DiCaprio movies, right? Was he really seeing this evil, or was he insane? Was he going crazy? Um, and so this adds another layer of Gothic that really makes it much more suspenseful and really taps into the American psyche. Um, he often portrays extreme circumstances, right? Whether it's war or cemeteries or abandoned things, great illness, something like that, great evil. Um, Great sadness. There's extreme circumstances that are portrayed in these stories. And his contemporaries that also write Gothic continue to do the same thing, such as Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Yellow Wallpaper. But also in the late 19th century, we see American writing going much more towards nature writing, towards travel writing, towards journey writing, right? Exploration out west, all those kinds of things. But post-Civil War, early 20th century, we begin to see the development of the Southern Gothic, right? And that is, again, to sort of rekindle this idea of the darkness within the human spirit, right? And it begins to be not only written by women and for women, but also begins to be adopted by marginalized groups, anti-slavery groups, things like that. So it gets rekindled, and then it never really dies after that. It takes different shapes, it takes different forms, but it never really dies. And meanwhile, in Europe, in England, we have Dracula, we have Jekyll and Hyde, we have like sort of the birth of the vampire novels and whatnot. So everything's kind of working together to create this idea of the Gothic in a more sophisticated and complex way. One thing that happens in as a result of the Southern Gothic is we see this blurring of not only romanticism, that idea of imagination and emotion and that and whatnot, but this blurring with realism, right? With telling stories of everyday people, of everyday lives, of the grittiness of everyday lives. And it's really an interesting moment because what it does is it takes this sort of fantastical genre and makes it much more believable, right? Making the unbelievable more believable, right? Which is great for an audience. Gothic, therefore, is by definition what we call a subversive genre. Um, what does that mean? So essentially, if we have a subversive story, generally what you have is you'll have sort of what I call an in-your-face message, that it doesn't really take a lot of interpretation and analytical skills to get the message of the story, right? Anybody can read and go like, okay, and it's usually a perfectly fine message, right? Um, but with a Gothic genre, which goes along with this idea of things being hidden, things being secretive, whatnot, there is always a hidden message, right? So the in your face message is hiding the hidden message. And that hidden message is usually targeted at the intended audience. So if it is, sort of written for women, then this might be a message that, um, women are picking up on in order to rally them, to organize, to become active against something that might be oppressing their marginalized group, right? It doesn't have to be women. It could be however, whatever the audience is that, might be considered the primary audience and hiding from audiences who might read it or watch the movie or whatever, but won't get it, right? Because they're not a part of that group, so they're not going to get those same sensitivities. So because it is by definition a subversive genre, it is incumbent on us as literary analysts to be able to recognize a Gothic story so that we know, listen, there's probably going to be a hidden message here. And so we've talked about some of those already, but if we see now, just because you see one of these doesn't mean that it's Gothic, right? But if you start seeing a lot of these, then we may very well be in the Gothic tradition. Now, again, as I told you, horror in today's world, right, in today's culture, is a little bit different than Gothic. It has a little bit different purpose than Gothic. So horror may or may not be subversive. Its idea is sort of cathartic, to provoke an immense amount of fear, in order for us to go through some kind of catharsis. Um, and so that's kind of, and you can kind of tell horror these days by just simply the amount of violence and the amount of blood. Gothic generally doesn't have a lot of blood. Horror does, right? These are anytime I say things like that, you can always find exceptions, but these are kind of things that we look at. So just because you have horror doesn't mean that we're in the full-fledged Gothic tradition of subversiveness, okay? So conventions of Gothic that we want to look at, we have to allow for the supernatural. Okay, there may or may not be supernatural. Evil priests, but it could also be evil doctors, evil politicians, evil, you know, anybody that's kind of has authority over us. Usually, a lot of times there's nightmares, right? Nightmares. We're living a nightmare, or it seems like a nightmare, or there's actually a nightmare in there, right? Or it feels like we're in the middle of a nightmare. There's cruel deeds, right? That reflect back on the past, right? There's sometimes torture. or implied torture. There is a disrespect, as I said, of the wisdom of the past. That somehow the traditions of the past are preventing, the characters from moving forward in a productive way into the future. Usually there's enclosed spaces, whether it's coffins, dungeons, graves, forests, an inability to escape, a sort of sense of claustrophobia. And then there's always, this idea of dilapidation, of this rundown, it's a kind of reflecting death or decay in its architecture, whether it's old churches, prisons, asylums, family estates. And as I said, a lot of times these things will have secret passages, dark forests, things like that. Again, the tyranny of the past, and these things that are representing human decay. But oftentimes in Gothic, our characters are women characters, women protagonists or antagonists, and women are often the hero or the victim. Now, this does change sometimes, and so if we look at like the movie Get Out, right, that was Gothic in a sense, but it was, sort of the protagonist was a Black man, right, representing that marginalized group. So this can change, but it's rarely the dominant, group that is our protagonist, right, or our victim. Okay, so I hope this helps you understand the Gothic genre a little bit. And as we read Gothic stories in the future, I want you to be sure to look for these conventions. And if you see enough of them that you think, oh, we're in the Gothic convention, then I want you to be sure to ask, okay, what's the in your face message? And what's the hidden message? And in order to get at that hidden message, we need to understand who might this story be written for? Who is the intended primary audience? And we get to bring in our detective skills, our analytical skills, and find a much deeper complexity in these stories. Okay? Enjoy the Gothic stories as we go forward, and I will be posting more information about these kinds of stories in future videos. Okay? Have a great day.